My name is James Cawley, and what you're about to hear is real, not exaggerated, just real. It's the kind of story that gets under your skin and doesn't leave. You may think you know it, but you don't know it like this. But first, the secret bonus episode at enterthedust.com is about to disappear. 48 hours, and it's gone. Subscribers will also get exclusive bonus stories, behind-the-scenes content, and private live stream access. Go to enterthedust.com and become part of a community of people just like us. All right? Enough of that. Let's get into it. This is one of the most disturbing true cases on record. John Johnston sat in the dark of the Bell farmhouse in 1817 and waited for what his neighbor had described. He had come as a skeptic. He was a practical man, a farmer, a neighbor, someone who had known John Bell long enough to trust his character, but who also understood that fear and sleeplessness and the particular imagination of a house full of children could produce accounts of things that had ordinary explanations. He had agreed to stay the night because John Bell had asked him to, because the Bell family had been losing sleep for months and John Bell's dignity would not allow him to keep asking for help without at least showing a neighbor the thing he needed help with. The sounds came, the knocking on the walls, the drag of something across the floorboards that sounded precisely like chains, the sounds from the bedposts that Betsy Bell had been describing as rats gnawing. Rats that, when the family searched, were never there. Johnston sat through the sounds. Then, in the small hours, he spoke into the darkness. He said, "In the name of the Lord, who are you? And what do you want?" The sound stopped. Just like that. In response to the invocation of a name that the thing in the darkness apparently recognized as having authority over it, the sound stopped. Johnston noted this. He filed it away with the precision of a man who had come to see rather than to believe, who was interested in evidence rather than confirmation. The silence that followed the question was the most disturbing thing he had experienced that night. Because a sound produced by animals or wind or the structural complaint of an old house does not respond to the name of the Lord by stopping. Johnston went home the next morning and told John Bell that whatever was in his house was not what Bell had assumed. It was not a natural disturbance. It was something that listened. The Robertson County, Tennessee of 1817 was not a community with patience for the inexplicable. It was a frontier community, prosperous, hardworking, organized around the Red River Baptist Church that had anchored local life since 1791. And the people who lived in it had built their world from cleared forest and cultivated bottomland, and the specific moral seriousness of a Southern Baptist congregation that took its theology literally and its obligations to each other personally. They were not credulous. They were not people who explained difficult things away by reaching for supernatural answers. They were people who worked the land and sat in church on Sundays and trusted what they could see and measure and account for. This matters because when a community of that disposition begins to confirm a supernatural event, the confirmation carries a different weight than it would from a community predisposed to believe. The neighbors of John Bell who came to the farmhouse and returned home with accounts of what they had witnessed were not sensation seekers or the easily suggestible. They were men and women who milked cows and hoed corn and had no financial or social incentive to claim they had heard a disembodied voice quote, Scripture. They were people whose credibility in the community was their most valuable possession. When they said they had heard it, they meant they had heard it. The Bell family was among the most respected in the area. John Bell had arrived from North Carolina in 1804, had cleared land on the south bank of the Red River, had built a farm that grew to nearly 400 acres, and had established himself as a deacon and then an elder of the Red River Baptist Church. His wife, Lucy Williams Bell, was beloved in the community, a woman described by every account as warm, capable, and deeply devout. Their children filled the farmhouse with the ordinary noise of a large frontier family. They were not a family on the margins. They were not desperate or eccentric or socially isolated. They were the kind of family that a community measures its own stability against. When John Bell came to his neighbor James Johnston in the fall of 1817 and told him that something was happening in his house that he could not explain, Johnston took it seriously because Bell was not a man given to imagination. Bell had already tried to manage it privately, had kept it from the neighbors for months, had told himself it would stop, had prayed over it. It was not stopping. He asked for help. The full picture that emerged over the following 4 years would push every framework that Robertson County, Tennessee possessed to its absolute limit, and then past it. The entity arrived in stages, the way something intelligent builds a relationship, rather than the way a storm arrives all at once. It began with sounds, knocking on the exterior walls of the house at odd hours. Then, sounds inside, a gnawing at the bedposts that sounded exactly like rats, but produced no rats when the family looked. A dog fighting something in the room, a sound of chains dragged across the floor, a gulping and smacking that had no body attached to it. Bed sheets were pulled from sleeping children. Pillows were jerked from beneath their heads. At first, these things were explicable, if barely. There were always rats in the walls of Tennessee farmhouses. There were always strange sounds at night in a wooden house in the countryside. The Bell family told themselves this for months. Then the hands arrived. Betsy Bell was 12 years old when the haunting began. She was the youngest daughter, slight and young, and apparently the entity's first chosen target. The welts appeared on her face and body, red handprints that the family could see and touch and document. Marks left by a slap or a pinch that had no visible origin. Her hair was pulled. She was struck hard enough that she was knocked from her feet on at least one occasion. She began experiencing fainting spells, smothering sensations that she described as a weight pressing onto her chest, episodes of exhaustion that left her prostrate. Her condition became a subject of community concern. Neighbors who visited and witnessed the marks on her could not attribute them to any mechanism they recognized. John Bell Sr. began to change during this period as well, but differently. He developed what the accounts describe as a twitching in his face, spasms that he could not control, that progressed over the following years into paralysis of the jaw and mouth, difficulty swallowing, difficulty speaking. He began to lose weight. His vigor, which had always been the visible product of a man who worked 400 acres with his own hands, gradually left him. The entity, when it began to speak, made no secret of its intentions toward him. It called him Old Jack Bell. It announced, with what the accounts consistently describe as a kind of cheerful clarity, that it was going to kill him. This is the document that the testimony of Robertson County produces. A thing that chose, named what it was choosing, and then spent 4 years doing it. When Johnston's experiment, the invocation that made the sound stop, circulated through the community, more neighbors began to visit the Bell farm. Some came from curiosity. Some came from the specific religious impulse of people who wanted to determine whether what John Bell was experiencing was diabolical or divine. Some came because the story had already traveled far enough that visitors arrived from adjacent counties and eventually from greater distances. The entity responded to this audience by expanding. What had been sounds became a whisper. What had been a whisper became, over the course of weeks, a clear, articulate female voice that every person present in the house could hear distinctly. It spoke scripture. It sang hymns with apparent devotion and remarkable accuracy. It engaged in conversation with visitors, demonstrating knowledge that its interlocutors found difficult to explain. It addressed people by name before they had been introduced. It discussed the private affairs of neighbors in ways that should have been inaccessible to any entity that had not been present when those affairs occurred. It answered questions about its own identity with what witnesses consistently described as maddening inconsistency. When asked who it was, it claimed at various times to be the witch of Old Kate Batts, a neighbor of the Bells who had a land dispute with John Bell in 1817. A spirit of the dead, a spirit of an unquiet grave, something older. Then it denied each identity it had just claimed. The entity seemed to find the question of its own nature genuinely amusing, as if being asked who it was the most entertaining thing that had been put to it in Robertson County. And it had no intention of letting the entertainment end by answering clearly. When visitors pressed harder, when ministers tried to pin it down with the specific language of theology, it responded with scripture that demonstrated an understanding of the texts that outpaced many of the ministers who had come to assess it. This is the thing that made skeptics leave the Bell farm more unsettled than they had arrived. It was not merely noisy. It was not merely violent. It was intelligent in a way that was not compatible with the available explanations. A poltergeist does not debate theology. A young girl performing ventriloquism cannot simultaneously attend two churches 12 miles apart. The most documented example of its apparent range involved two preachers. The entity reproduced, in perfect sequence, and with complete accuracy, a sermon delivered by Reverend James Gunn of Bethel Methodist Church, and then, without pause, reproduced the sermon of a preacher named Sugg Fort. Both sermons had been delivered at the same hour. The churches were 12 miles apart. No single person could have attended both. No single person could have heard both on the same day. The entity had apparently heard both simultaneously, or it had access to information that distance and time should have made unavailable. Visitors who arrived as skeptics left with accounts that did not fit easily into the frameworks they had brought with them. The entity was informed. It was theological. It was aware of events at a distance. It was aware of events in the past. And it maintained, across 4 years of interaction with hundreds of different people, a completely consistent set of preferences and animosities that could not have been sustained by anything random or mechanical. It loved Lucy Bell. It called her the most perfect woman to walk the earth. When Lucy fell ill, the entity sang hymns to her bedside and brought fresh fruit from the orchard to her room. It tended to her with the particular attention of something that had chosen her as an object of genuine care. The fruit appeared. The singing was real. Lucy recovered. The entity took what credit it felt was due. It hated John Bell, not intermittently, not variably, with a consistency that never wavered across 4 years. That tracked John Bell's declining health with what the accounts can only describe as satisfaction. That slapped his face during his seizures and removed his shoes when he tried to walk and called him Old Jack with the familiarity of a hatred that was deeply personal. That had a history. That had reasons it was under no obligation to share. The same entity, the same farmhouse, the same 4 years. Love and destruction, maintained in perfect consistency, aimed at the two people who slept in the same bed. Let us name the source problem before going further, because this story requires it. The primary document for the Bell Witch haunting is Martin V. Ingram's An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch, published in 1894, 73 years after the haunting ended. Ingram was a newspaper editor, not a witness. He claimed to be working from a manuscript written by Richard Williams Bell, a son of John Bell who was 6 years old when the disturbances began, and who composed his account, approximately 30 years after the events. Richard Williams Bell's manuscript has never been independently located or verified. The earliest surviving written reference to the Bell Witch is a letter by a Captain John R. Bell, no relation to the family, written in 1820, mentioning a haunting in Robertson County without naming it. An 1880 centennial account and Goodspeed's 1886 county history both reference the story, establishing that it circulated locally in the decades before Ingram's book. These are not eyewitness accounts. They are community memory, which is to say, they are evidence that the story was real and widely known, but not evidence of the specific details Ingram later documented. What this means is that the Bell Witch, as we know it in detail, has been filtered through the lens of a Victorian-era newspaper editor working from a second-hand manuscript, published 2 generations after the events it describes. The Andrew Jackson visit, which features prominently in many retellings, the general stopping in to challenge the entity with a witch hunter companion, the witch pricking the man until he fled, appears in no independent historical documentation. There is no record placing Jackson at the Bell Farm between 1817 and 1821. It may be true. It is more likely embellishment that served the story's growth. What cannot be embellished because it is part of the documented community record of Robertson County is that something happened in the Bell household between 1817 and 1821 that the people of that community could not explain. The Goodspeed brothers' 1886 history noted that so great was the excitement that people came from hundreds of miles around to witness the manifestations. Community-wide attention on that scale does not arise from fabrication. It arises from something people believed they were seeing. And then there is the chemistry. John Bell Sr. died on December 20th, 1820. His decline had been visible for the preceding 2 years. The facial spasms that progressed to paralysis, the difficulty swallowing and speaking, the loss of vitality in a man who had been vigorous, the specific neurological character of his deterioration. On December 19th, he failed to rise from bed. On December 20th, he was gone. John Bell Jr. went to the medicine cupboard that morning to retrieve his father's remedies. He found the 3 familiar vials had been replaced by 1, a single dark, smoky liquid he did not recognize and had not placed there. He administered a drop to the family cat. The cat died immediately. John Jr. threw the vial into the fireplace. The liquid erupted in a bright blue flame that shot up the chimney. The entity's response upon learning what they had found: I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, which fixed him. Dr. Megan Mann, a chemistry professor at Austin Peay State University, has examined the documented symptoms of John Bell's death and reached conclusions that are difficult to set aside. Blue flame is the precise color produced when arsenic is burned. Not approximately, not poetically, but chemically, specifically. Arsenic produces a blue emission when introduced to fire. The garlic smell that witnesses reported on John Bell's breath as he was dying is a documented symptom of arsenic poisoning. The neurological progression of his illness, the facial paralysis, the difficulty swallowing, the seizures, is clinically consistent with chronic arsenic exposure. And the cat's immediate death upon receiving a single drop makes complete biochemical sense. Cats lack the specific metabolic pathway that allows most mammals to process arsenic, making them uniquely and rapidly vulnerable to a chemical that a human body might tolerate at low doses for a longer period before failing. Someone poisoned John Bell Sr. with arsenic. The chemistry supports this. The vial was real. The blue flame was documented. The question that the chemistry opens, and that it cannot close, is who? Who placed that vial in the cupboard? Who had been administering small doses of arsenic to John Bell over the preceding years, producing the slow neurological decline that the accounts document? Who had both access to the Bell household and motive for John Bell's death? The name that researchers return to is Richard Powell. Powell was Betsy Bell's school teacher, the man she would eventually marry after calling off her engagement to Joshua Gardner. At the time of the haunting, Powell was secretly married to a woman named Esther, a marriage he concealed because Esther was significantly older than him. Esther died in 1821, the same year the entity departed, the same year Betsy ended her engagement, the same year that Powell became free to pursue a woman whose father was conveniently no longer alive to evaluate him as a suitor. Neighbors reported hearing Powell speak in foreign languages when he believed himself unobserved. He was discovered on at least one occasion with a book of unusual text that he immediately concealed when seen. He was educated, intelligent, and, critically, the only person with a clear motive for wanting both Joshua Gardner removed from Betsy's future and John Bell removed from the world. Bell was a community pillar and a church elder who would have had strong opinions about his daughter's suitor. The arsenic theory, if Powell is the agent, builds a coherent framework. Powell, educated and trained in whatever he studied from his concealed books, had access to the Bell farmhouse as Betsy's teacher, had knowledge of chemistry sufficient to select a poison that would produce a slow neurological decline consistent with the illnesses of the era, and had every reason to want the entity's apparent campaign against John Bell and the Gardner engagement to succeed. The entity's behavior, its consistent targeting, its declared objectives, its 4-year campaign, would, on this reading, be a cover for a very human crime. Powell is not convicted by this. He is named by it. The circumstantial shape is there. The evidence that would close it is not. And the framework breaks down against the sermons, against the names of visitors unknown to anyone in the house, against the specific details that the entity demonstrated it knew before anyone in that room had spoken them aloud. Human or not, someone knew what they were doing. John Bell's funeral was one of the largest Robertson County had seen. The entity attended. As the mourners filed out of the graveyard, a long procession of neighbors, family, community members who had come to pay their respects to a man who had been a cornerstone of the Red River Baptist Church. A voice accompanied them. The entity sang body-drinking songs over the grave of the deacon and elder and patriarch. It laughed. It did not stop until the last person had passed through the graveyard gates. This was not incidental. This was the entity completing something. Whatever it had come to do to John Bell, it had done. And it announced the completion with the specific vulgarity of a thing that had no use for the rituals his community offered in his memory. The hymn singer who had tended to Lucy in her illness had no use for the hymns being sung over old Jack Bell. After John Bell's death, the entity's violent energy turned almost entirely toward one remaining objective: preventing Betsy's marriage to Joshua Gardner. Wherever the couple went on, or near the Bell property, to the fields, to the river, to the cave that sits on the Bell land, the entity followed them. It taunted. It abused. It demanded Betsy not marry Joshua without offering a complete explanation of why. The demand was absolute, and the enforcement was relentless. On Easter Monday of 1821, Betsy Bell met Joshua Gardner at the river and broke off their engagement. The entity, having accomplished both of what appear to have been its primary objectives, the death of John Bell and the dissolution of Betsy's engagement, told the family it was leaving. It visited Lucy Bell privately and told her it would return in 7 years. It left. In 1828, true to its word, it came back. It visited Lucy and her sons Richard and Joel. They chose not to engage with it. It left again, promising this time to return in 107 years. That return, if it occurred, was not documented at the scale of the original haunting. The house where John Bell died no longer stands. The land is still there, along the Red River, and a cave on the original Bell property has been added to the National Historic Register. The Bell Witch refuses, even now, to resolve into a single explanation. The arsenic theory accounts for John Bell's death and locates it in the realm of human crime rather than supernatural visitation. Richard Powell had motive and cunning. Betsy Bell's distress during those years, her fainting, her smothering sensations, her exhaustion, could have been a young woman under pressure from a frightening situation she could not name or escape. The poltergeist theory suggests that the physical phenomena centered on an adolescent girl under extreme emotional stress, which is consistent with documented cases of psychokinetic activity associated with pubescent children in duress. The ventriloquism theory, advanced even in 1880, suggests Betsy may have been producing the entity's voice herself, whether consciously or not. None of these theories account for the simultaneous sermons. 2 sermons, delivered at the same hour, 12 miles apart, reproduced in perfect sequence by a voice that had not attended either one. This detail sits at the center of the Bell Witch documentation, like a splinter that every proposed explanation presses against and cannot quite extract. If the entity was a human perpetrator using elaborate trickery, Powell or someone like him, they had access to information from 12 miles away in real time in 1817, with no available mechanism for receiving it. No telegraph, no telephone. No method by which a person in the Bell farmhouse could know, within minutes of the service ending, what a minister in a church 12 miles away had said. If the entity was Betsy's unconscious psychokinetic manifestation, then Betsy's unconscious mind was simultaneously attending 2 Methodist services in different buildings a half-day's walk apart. And if it was simply a fabricated detail added to Ingram's account by someone who wanted the story to be more impressive, then we must ask why the community of Robertson County, which had been living with the story for 70 years before Ingram published it, never contradicted it. We must ask why the ministers whose sermons were allegedly reproduced, and whose congregations would have known immediately if the claim was false, apparently did not dispute it. This detail, and others like it, the advanced knowledge of visitors' names, the accounts of distant events, the prediction of John Bell's death before the family discovered it, occupy a space that the available explanations cannot fill. They exist at the edge of what the record can account for, and that edge has never been resolved. What the Bell Witch ultimately leaves us with is not a solved case or a confirmed haunting. It is a 4-year record of something that maintained its preferences with iron consistency, that loved one person and hated another in the same household, that declared its intentions and then fulfilled them, that addressed strangers by name and recited sermons from rooms it had never entered, that sang hymns to a woman in her illness and drinking songs over her husband's grave, and that has never been definitively explained as either supernatural or human, and that appears to have known with certainty exactly what it was doing. Lucy Bell outlived her husband by more than a decade. She stayed on the land. She stayed where the entity had brought her fruit from the orchard and sung hymns at her bedside and called her the most perfect woman alive. She stayed where it had spent 4 years destroying the man who lay beside her every night. She tended the farm and raised the children and buried John Bell in Robertson County soil and said nothing in the surviving record about what it meant to have been the beloved of the same thing that killed her husband. The surviving record does not preserve Lucy's interpretation of any of it, whether she found it strange to be tended to by something that also destroyed, whether the tenderness and the violence felt like 2 parts of the same sentence, or like evidence of something she understood that everyone else missed. What we know is that she stayed, that she accepted what the entity had given her, and then lived in the place where it had given it, for years after it was gone. The entity left and returned as promised and left again. The house fell eventually, the way all wooden houses eventually fall, to weather, to time, to the indifference of subsequent generations who build on the same ground and call it theirs. The cave remains, added to the National Historic Register, visited by tourists who come hoping to feel something in the dark below the Bell land. What chose John Bell Sr. to despise and Lucy Bell to adore, and maintained that choice with unwavering consistency across 4 years and through the visits of hundreds of strangers and the scrutiny of ministers and the attempts of its own human explanations to contain it. This thing has never explained its reasons to any living person. It called itself Kate. It denied being Kate. It answered contradictory questions about its own nature with what witnesses consistently described as amusement, as if the question itself was the entertainment, as if being asked who it was and why it had come was the funniest thing it had encountered in Robertson County, Tennessee, in the year of our Lord, 1817. The thing that chose and kept choosing, the thing that maintained its selection, this one to love, that one to destroy, through 4 winters on the Red River without once reversing course or explaining itself or showing any sign that the distinction it had made was anything other than final. The thing that knew your name before you said it, knew your sermon before you preached it, knew the poison that would work on the particular body of one specific man in a house on the Red River. The thing that loved a woman and killed her husband and sang drinking songs over his grave while the last mourner walked through the graveyard gate into a February morning in Robertson County, Tennessee, and went home to a world that was never quite the same, and then went where it went, and came back when it said it would, and left again. And if it made any further promise about returning, the record has not yet caught up to that appointment. That was the Bell Witch case, written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. There's something that stays with you after a story like this, and it isn't the violence, or the voice, or even the death. It's the choosing. The idea that whatever moved through that farmhouse on the Red River didn't arrive randomly, didn't scatter its attention equally across the household, didn't rage without direction. It selected one to love, one to destroy, and it never wavered. 4 winters, hundreds of witnesses, the scrutiny of ministers and skeptics and men who came to disprove and left unable to. And through all of it, the thing held its position like it had made a decision long before any of them were born and simply came to carry it out. That's what lingers, not the haunting, the certainty of it. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that sit at the edge of what the record can account for, that refuse to resolve into clean explanations, that leave you with more questions than answers, and somehow feel more honest for it, then you're in the right place. I'm glad we found you. Make sure to check out our YouTube channel, where I bring some of these stories to life visually. You can find a direct link on our website at enterthedust.com. I release a new original story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here. I'll be waiting for you next time, and I think you'll love the next story. And remember, some things don't haunt a place, they haunt a choice, and they never stop making it.